let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent His only Son into the world so that we might live through Him. In this is love, not that we've loved God, but that He loved us, to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in us. So let's go back, and we're going to look at 2 verses at a time and work our way back through this paragraph. Now, the theme of this section of 1 John, in fact, most of John's letter here is love. And he breaks down for us some really important principles about love. And here's why this is an important message for us today. Love is a word that we use a lot. It's a very dynamic word in our language, and we apply it to a lot of different circumstances. In the same way, we use the same language, whether we're talking about food that we love or an event that we love. Like, I love football, I love cheese, I love my dog, I love my wife, I love my grandma, I love my neighbor, right? But we don't, unless there's something wrong, we don't always mean the same thing when we use that word love. And there's a lot of confusion in our culture today about what this word actually means. But what we're looking at this morning is going to show us what God means when He tells us that we ought to love one another. And what we find right off is that people that love show God to the world. In fact, love, the amount of love in our life, shows our connection with God. And we're going to talk about the kind of love that God is talking about in this section of 1 John. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to look at verses 7 and 8. We find something important about this kind of love about which we speak. First of all, it says that love is from God. And then in verse 8, the last phrase in that verse is that God is love. So whatever we're talking about this morning, this biblical love that God tells us should be in us, is something more than loving food or loving a sport or loving to do an activity. It is something that is rooted in the very character and nature of God Himself. It comes out of Him, but is also part of His very essence. God is love. And a careful reading of the Scriptures will show us that every attribute of God, every descriptive quality of God is rooted in His love. And we can't understand who God is apart from this idea of God being a God of love. Now, if we go to the next slide, another phrase is going to be highlighted for us, and that is the idea that whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. This is important for us because to know about God and know the things of God is completely different than knowing God Himself. See, it's possible to know the Scriptures, to memorize them from one end to the next. It's impossible to have a very accurate and precise theology, be doctrinally sound and healthy, but never know God. What is the litmus test for if you actually know God or if you just know things about God? I got interested a few years back in the idea of counterfeit money. Not because I wanted to make any, all right? I didn't want to be a counterfeiter, but I was like, how is it in the 21st century people can still get away with making fake money? And I found out it's a lot harder today than it used to be. It used to be a really big problem. Now with everything being digitalized and going online and everything, there's other ways people can steal your money or steal your identity. But counterfeiting is still a thing. In fact, when I go to Honduras, they will accept American money there. They really like American money because it's worth more than the Honduran lempira, which is the money that they use. But they don't like the denomination of a $20 bill because apparently it is the most commonly counterfeited denomination of money. So they're like, I don't want 20s, but they'll take everything else. Did you know on your money, and if you want to, you can get out a bill, anything above a 1, 5 and up, and if you hold it up to light, did you know there's a little bar that runs down the middle of it that you can't see very clearly unless you hold up the light? And that bar is meant to be an anti-counterfeiting protection. And in a lot of ways, love is this. When we hold our lives up and we look deeply into ourselves and we ask the question, is there love in my life? That is the thing that brings to light whether or not we actually have a relationship with God. If we're not loving, simply put, we've not been born of God, neither do we know God. That's how important this is. It is an impossibility to have a relationship, a knowing relationship, a depending relationship on God, and not have love in our lives. So what is this love? Is it an emotional response? Is it a feeling? Is it something that goes on up here? Is it a strong preference for God in opposition to, say, Buddha or Allah or what? What does it mean to love others and to love God? Let's go to the next two verses, verses 9 and 10. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent His only Son into the world. We're going to stop right there. It was made manifest. What is this love that we're talking about? Well, God showed it to us. He made it manifest. That means He brought it to light. He shined the spotlight on it so that we could look at it and get a clear picture of it. So what we're talking about this morning, the way we're going to identify and define love is rooted in God and who He is, what comes from God, and we got to look at what God did to show love to grasp what love really is. So what is love? God shows us in this. Next slide. God shows His love to us in the fact that He sent His only Son into the world so that we might live. Love saved us. So at its root, what love is seeking the life or the greatest good of the object of the beloved. Love is an action. It is a choice. Love's a verb. It is a commitment to the other person. The person that we love is one to whom we are committed to give of ourselves for their well-being. That is love. And the pattern of that is this, that God Himself, God the Son, took on flesh and entered into the world to live among us, and not just to be with us and point out all the ways that we went wrong, not just to teach us the right way, but to save us. God shows us what love is by becoming one of us for our own salvation. And then further than that, it points out a little bit more clearly how is it that He went about saving us. The next slide, we're going to highlight into verse 12. That word propitiation, I'm using the English Standard Version, the atoning sacrifice, I believe is what the NIV says, or the sacrifice that deals with sin. See, this word in the original language is a multifaceted and very rich and dynamic word. And that's why it's translated various ways in our English translations. But the core idea behind this word of propitiation or atoning sacrifice or sacrifice that deals with sin is that it is a sacrifice that is put forth to deal with the sins and rebellion of one group so that their relationship can be fixed with the group that they offended. And in this context, it's talking about our relationship with God. Our relationship with God was not right because of sin in our lives. We had rebelled against God, rejected God's purposes. But while we were still in that state of rebellion, still rejecting God's purpose in our life, He entered into this world to save us by giving of His very life to die our death, to impart His life so that we can be with Him forever. And so that's the root idea of love, is that love looks to the object that needs the love and works for the well-being of the one that needs love for the greater good. And when we love God, it's not that we can do anything to make God better, but that we devote of ourselves to His glory and to show the world that, hey, He is the greatest that there is. We empty of ourselves to show that He is greater. We go to the next slide. This is Ruth. For those of you out in your car, you can't see this picture. My youngest daughter, Ruth, she's sitting there, pink bow in her head, pink shirt, and she's holding two babies sitting in a little rocking chair. It's a little bit hard to see. One is a regular little baby doll. Pigtails, looks like a baby, and she's holding it in her arm on her lap. But then the other is this robot laying across her lap. The thing's legs don't even bend. It's hard as a rock. It's got pointy places on it. It's actually, for those of you that know about these kinds of things, it's a Megazord from Power Rangers, okay? it's not a baby doll. But to Ruth, it is her baby. She carries it around. She lays it down for naps. She covers it with a blanket. She changes its diaper. She burps it. She pats its back, just like her other babies. And sometimes you'll see baby doll, Megazord, laying there down for a nap. And more than this, Ruth, we have caught her with a broom, burping the broom, laying the broom down, saying, my baby, and covering it with a blanket. She has had sticks. She finds random objects that really are not babies, and she transforms them into babies, and she treats them like her regular babies. Now, why do I tell you that? In the theme of love, here it is. None of those objects are babies, and they're not particularly lovable. They hurt to hug, okay? That Megazord will put your eye out if you hug it too aggressively. It is not a pretty thing. It is not a comfortable thing. But it is transformed into a baby because of her love for it. She doesn't care that that baby doesn't make a sound, doesn't care that it's soft, doesn't care that it's cute, but it's her baby. Now, let's let that sink in a little bit, because what we've been building up to is what is love? See, our culture reverses what love is and says, okay, love is when something does something for me and makes me feel good, and I have a strong, positive response back to it, therefore I love it. I love this person because they make me laugh, they're fun to be with, they do this for me, they're good people, I love them. I love pizza because it tastes amazing. I love, and it's always about me. And when we say we love something, it's because that thing does something for me, or that person does something for me. And often, even when we talk about loving God, it's because what God does for me. And there's a place for that. It's thanksgiving and gratitude and adoration. But if our faith never develops beyond, God, I love you because of what you do for me, it never reaches into the realm of, God, I love you because of who you are, we have a stunted and anemic faith that is self-interested and self-motivated. But love that we see here is made manifest in this, that God sent His Son into the world to save us from our sins. More than that, to be the propitiation, the sin sacrifice for our sins. See, we were not particularly lovable when Jesus came into the world. Jesus knew when He entered into this world, it wasn't that we were going to welcome Him with open arms and hug Him like, oh, you're God the Son. We accept everything you say. No, He knew it would end in the cross. And yet He came. We go to the last slide, and we're going to finish up with verses 11 and 12. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Let's just stop and pause and let that sink in a little bit. If God so loved us. Now that's not so as in He loved us so much, although that's true. It's of God in this way. Or if this is what God did to love us, we ought also to love one another. Jesus is meant to be a pattern of love. God showed us what love is and showed us what it is to love others. And so when it says, whoever loves has been born of God, the litmus test, the counterfeit test, are we truly Christians? If we love others for the sake of just loving them and not because of what they do for us, not waiting for them to become lovable or easy to love, see, that's the love that God shows us, and that is the love that transforms the world. If we love one another, going on to verse 12, God abides in us and His love is perfected in us. Now that word perfected does not point to the fact that God's love is imperfect. It means about how it is manifested in our lives. If we love one another, God's love comes to its fruition and fulfillment in our own lives. How is it that we know that we are living in God's love? How are we living out what John is talking about here in 1 John? How is it that we love one another in the way that God has told us to love? It's by loving one another. and allowing God's love to come to full fruition in us. So what do we take away from this? Here's the thing about this. Love is huge. In fact, when Jesus was asked what the two greatest, well, actually he was asked what the first greatest commandment is. He was told, what is the greatest command? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is like the first. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in a lot of ways, we're good with that as long as we can define love and we can define our neighbor. But what we find when we read the Scriptures is what love is not up for us to define. Love is self-giving, self-sacrificial. It is focused on the well-being of the beloved, not on ourselves, and a lot of times it hurts. How much? Enough to put the Son of God on a cross 2,000 years ago. And that is the pattern of love. When God says to love God, that means He comes first. It means our commitment and our loyalty and our worship is geared towards Him. And when we're told to love our neighbor, it means that even at our own expense, we put the well-being of others before ourselves. And the pattern for what Jesus did is the pattern that helps us to live that out. And who is our neighbor? Well, Jesus told a parable about that, about a good Samaritan. I'm going to end with that, and then hopefully challenge us to ask the question, is my life marked by love? This parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? Who is it that I'm supposed to show love to? Because, just like all people, the religious elite of Jesus' day wanted to try to put a strict definition on who my neighbor was. Well, it's a fellow believer. It's another Israelite. It's a priest. It's someone who's doing the right thing. It's someone that's in God's faith community. That's who we show love to, right? And Jesus is like, well, yeah, but there's more. And he tells a story about a man, an Israelite, who is traveling down a road, and he's mugged, he's beaten, left for dead, and all of his goods are taken from him. And then going down the road, he is passed, first of all, by a priest that works at the temple, that handles the sacrifices. And the priest passed him by on the other side of the road. Well, why would he do that? Because according to the law, if he touched that body, he becomes unclean and can't perform his religious duties. So the Jewish ear would have been like, well, duh, because he's a priest. He can't go there and he can't help this guy, or he becomes unclean and he can't help all of us, right? Well, then the next one that comes by is a Levite, part of the priestly clan that worked in the temple and made sacrifices. And he also walks by on the other side of the road for the same reason. But then finally there comes a Samaritan. Now, if you're not familiar with who Samaritans were at this period of history, they were north of Israel. They had never fully gotten back to Israelite religion after they'd been conquered by the Assyrians, and they had assimilated Israelite religious beliefs with other religious beliefs from the conquering parties. And worse than that, in the Israelite mind, they were mixed breeds. They weren't 100% Israelite. They were mixed with Canaanites. And so they were viewed as unclean, immoral, heretics that didn't worship God the right way because they weren't connected with the temple. And the Samaritan walks by, and he goes and he helps the man. He binds up his wounds. He takes him to an inn. He pays his fee, and he says, take care of him, and if I owe anything more when I come back, I will pay for it. Then Jesus asked the question, who is it that was the neighbor? And of course the answer is the one who had compassion on him, the one who loved him. Here's where that leads us. We like to qualify what is love, who is my neighbor, but Jesus answers both of those for us. Love is given when it hurts for the well-being of others. Love is working for the well-being of others even when they're not particularly easy to get along with, even if in our mind we don't believe they're going to accept it, because Jesus is the pattern, and they didn't really accept what he said. They killed him. When we walk in the footsteps of Jesus, we love even when it hurts. Who do we love? Anybody that God puts in our life. Because what we find is a neighbor is not someone that comes to us, but rather those that we come into contact with. Technically speaking, in the parable Jesus told, the priest and the Levite were closer neighbors to the Israelite man that was hurt. But Jesus said they weren't neighbors. The one that was a neighbor was the one that made himself a neighbor and went to the man that was suffering and helped him. As much as it is up to us, any human being is our neighbor. And so this radical kind of love, this self-emptying that is rooted in the pattern of what Jesus did for us, is what God's people are called to. It is one that looks beyond the self, beyond comfort, beyond preferences, into a world that is hurting, afraid, broken, and lost. And if God manifested His love towards us through Christ in this way, we as His church are called to do the same in the world around us. So as we enter into this Christmas season, as the day gets closer, the twofold thing for us to keep in mind is, do we understand what happened in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago when Jesus entered into this world? Understand how huge of an act of love that was for God to take flesh on for the purpose of dying for us. The cradle led to the cross. And secondly, as we prepare for His second coming, when we look at our lives, are our lives marked by love for others? Do we put the well-being of others before self in a commitment to love God and put Him first above all things? Is that how our lives look?